Remember when you could leave your doors unlocked at night
Oh,
and
yeah.
kids could roam the neighborhood till sundown without a second thought?
Right, exactly.
In the early 1970s, Fort Worth, Texas was that kind of place.
Hmm.
But this story, like a hidden current beneath a calm surface, takes us to a place where innocence collides with a chilling reality.
It really does. It's a reminder that even in the most seemingly idyllic communities, darkness can lurk, shattering lives and leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions.
Today we're taking a deep dive into two true crime cases that'll stay with you long after this episode ends.
I think you're right.
First, we'll unravel the decades-long search for a sister's killer in Fort Worth, the case of Carla Walker.
Okay.
Then we'll journey back to 1814 London to uncover the shocking events of the London beer flood.
Sounds good.
What's fascinating about these two cases, separated by time and geography,
Yeah.
is how they both expose the complexities of justice, the weight of responsibility, and the often unpredictable nature of truth.
Absolutely.
All right, let's unpack this first case. We've got articles, first-hand accounts, even some trial transcripts.
Wow.
Picture this. It's February 16th, 1974.
Right.
Carla Walker, a vibrant 17-year-old high school student in Fort Worth, is getting ready for her school's Valentine's Day dance.
Okay.
She's got the world at her feet. A loving family, a devoted boyfriend named Rodney McCoy, and shared dreams of attending Texas Tech University together.
Oh, wow.
It's a classic picture of young love, blossoming in a time when life seems simpler.
It's simpler time.
And it's crucial to understand the setting here.
Okay.
Fort Worth in the 70s was a different world.
Right.
Benbrook, the suburb where Carla lived, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name.
Yeah.
Kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on and nobody felt the need to lock their doors.
Really?
It was a community built on trust, a stark contrast to the events that would soon unfold.
It's hard to imagine that such a safe place could be the backdrop for such a horrific crime.
It was a time of innocence for sure.
Yeah.
So Carla and Rodney go to the dance, have a wonderful time, and when it ends, they decide to do what all the teenagers did back then.
What's that?
Cruise the main drag with a couple of friends.
Oh, yeah.
They hit up Taco Bell, grab some burgers, those classic teenage rituals that feel so universal.
I remember those days.
After dropping off their friends, Rodney and Carla park at the local bowling alley.
Okay.
It's late, probably around midnight, and Carla needs to use the restroom.
Okay.
They're just sitting in the car, most likely talking about their future, when suddenly the passenger door is ripped open.
Oh, my gosh.
A tall, menacing figure appears, brandishing a gun.
Oh, no.
He starts pistol whipping Rodney, beating him mercilessly.
That's terrible.
Carla, terrified, screams for help.
So scary.
The attacker drags Carla out of the car, utters a chilling phrase.
What did he say?
"You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?"
Oh, that just sends shivers down my spine.
And disappears into the night, with Carla leaving Rodney battered and barely conscious.
I can't imagine what was going through Rodney's mind at that moment.
Rodney, in and out of consciousness, hears Carla's last desperate plea.
What's that?
"Go get my dad."
Oh, my God.
It's a nightmare scenario. A sudden eruption of violence shattering the peace of that night.
Absolutely terrifying.
Somehow Rodney manages to get to the Walker house, covered in blood, panicked, barely able to speak.
Poor Rodney.
Carla's parents are immediately thrown into a frantic search for their daughter.
I can't imagine the terror and confusion.
Imagine the terror and confusion. One minute you're on a date, the next you're fighting for your life, and your girlfriend is being abducted.
Right.
It's every parent's worst fear realized in a horrifying instant.
Absolutely. It's a parent's worst nightmare.
They call the police, scour the neighborhood, desperately searching for any sign of Carla.
Yeah.
But it's 1974.
Right.
Forensic technology is in its infancy. There's no DNA testing, no widespread security cameras.
Makes it so much harder to investigate.
The police are relying heavily on witness statements and a few scant clues.
So they're really limited in what they can do.
One of those clues is a magazine clip found at the scene, apparently dropped by the attacker.
Okay, so what did they do with that?
It belonged to a fairly new model of gun, a .22 Ruger. Now, this is where the investigation gets interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The police compile a list of everyone in the area who owned that type of gun
Right.
and start painstakingly going through it.
Wow, what a process.
They question a truck driver named Glenn McCurley, who claims his .22 Ruger was stolen.
Interesting.
He even passes a polygraph test and is dismissed as a suspect.
So at this point, they're back to square one.
So at this point, the investigation hits a wall.
Yeah.
Worth is in shock.
Right.
Carla's abduction and the lack of answers have turned the city upside down.
That's understandable.
Kids are afraid to go out at night. Parents are on edge, and that sense of safety in Benbrook is shattered.
It's a classic case of how one event can completely change the atmosphere of a community.
This case becomes a chilling example of how quickly evil can intrude on even the most peaceful communities.
It forces us to confront the limits of our control and the random nature of violence, how it can erupt without warning, shattering lives and leaving communities grappling with fear and uncertainty.
And as the days stretch into weeks, the search for Carla continues, hope dwindling with each passing hour.
It must have been agonizing for her family.
Then 2 police officers, searching near Benbrook Lake, make a grim discovery.
Oh.
They spot a culvert, a concrete passageway under a road, and decide to investigate.
Okay.
Inside, they find Carla's body.
Oh no, that's awful.
It's a horrific scene.
Oh gosh.
Carla's beautiful dress from the dance is ripped open. She's covered in bruises, and it's clear she was brutally murdered.
That poor girl.
This young life full of promise snuffed out in an act of senseless violence.
It's just heartbreaking.
Carla's 12-year-old brother, Jim, remembers accompanying his parents to identify her body.
Oh,
He couldn't bear to go into the room.
understandable.
But even from down the hall, he could hear his mother's agonizing screams.
That's just devastating.
He later said, "It was like an animal sound. It'll stay with me as long as I live."
I can't even imagine.
That raw, visceral grief, the sound of a mother's heart breaking, becomes a haunting echo in this story.
It underscores the devastating ripple effects of this crime.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a case for the police to solve.
Right.
It was a family torn apart by unimaginable grief.
Yes.
A young boy forever scarred by the loss of his sister.
And for Jim Walker, that grief would fuel a decades-long quest for justice, a promise he made to his mother on her deathbed.
Wow. So he dedicated his life to finding her killer.
He dedicated his life to finding his sister's killer, even buying the family home, hoping that someday the guilt-ridden killer might show up to confess.
It's a testament to the enduring power of family and the unwavering pursuit of truth, even when the odds seem insurmountable.
But the case went cold.
Oh, no.
Years passed,
All right.
and despite Jim's efforts and his father's meticulously compiled notes, there were no breakthroughs.
That's so frustrating.
And then a series of disturbing events began to plague Fort Worth, casting a long shadow over Carla's unsolved murder.
What happened? Between 1977 and 1986, a string of murders shook Fort Worth, each bearing eerie similarities to Carla's case. Young women, many in their late teens or early 20s, were found strangled, often sexually assaulted, their bodies left in remote locations.
Hold on a second. So there's potentially a serial killer operating in Fort Worth, and the police are just ignoring it. That seems inconceivable.
Well, it's a natural question to ask. The public was understandably terrified. They suspected a serial killer was on the loose, and the similarities between the cases were hard to ignore. But the Fort Worth Police Department, for reasons that remain unclear, downplayed any connection between these murders. They insisted they were looking for multiple killers, not a single perpetrator.
But wouldn't acknowledging the possibility of a serial killer actually help focus the investigation and potentially prevent more deaths?
You would think so, right? There are a few theories about why they might have resisted that narrative. Some speculate they were trying to avoid widespread panic. Others believe it was a matter of resources. Admitting they might have a serial killer on their hands would require more manpower, more expertise. And then there's the possibility of simple bureaucratic inertia, a reluctance to change course even in the face of mounting evidence.
It's baffling to think that those in charge of protecting the community might prioritize managing public perception over catching a potential serial killer. And what about Jim? How did he react to these new developments?
Jim was already laser-focused on finding Carla's killer, but this new wave of violence only intensified his determination. He went to college, studied psychology, hoping to gain insights into the criminal mind, and even joined the police academy, dreaming of one day becoming a detective and taking over his sister's case. He was driven by a singular purpose to bring his sister's killer to justice, and maybe even prevent other families from enduring the same pain.
What an incredible display of dedication. He refused to let the case fade into obscurity, even as the years went by.
He did, unfortunately. Fate had other plans. During a routine physical, Jim discovered he had a congenital eye condition that disqualified him from becoming a police officer.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
After all that, to have his dream shattered.
It was a devastating blow. But even though he couldn't officially join the force, Jim never stopped investigating. He meticulously reviewed his father's notes, followed up on every lead, and kept Carla's memory alive, refusing to let her become just another cold case statistic. He even attended a self-defense seminar organized by the police where over 3,000 terrified citizens showed up. That's how widespread the fear had become.
3,000 people. It's a stark reminder of the collective trauma gripping Fort Worth, the fear that permeated daily life. It's almost unimaginable to live under that kind of shadow.
But what about those other murders? Did any of them ever get solved?
Sadly, no. Despite forming a task force, the police never closed a single one of those cases. They all went cold, adding another layer of mystery and frustration to Carla's unsolved murder. So all these years, this possible serial killer was out there free, while the families of the victims were left with no answers, no justice. It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder how many other cases like this are out there languishing in file cabinets, waiting for someone to bring the perpetrators to justice.
You're right. It certainly highlights the imperfections of our justice system, especially when it comes to cold cases. Sometimes, despite the best efforts of investigators and the unwavering dedication of families, the truth remains elusive.
It's a sobering reminder that justice isn't always swift or guaranteed. But let's get back to Jim. Did he ever find any answers? Did Carla's case ever see a break?
For decades, it seemed like the answer was no, however. Jim continued his own investigation, never losing faith, but the trail had gone cold. Then in 2018, a glimmer of hope appeared. A new detective, Leah Wagner, was assigned to the cold case unit, and she took a special interest in Carla's case.
Finally, someone was giving this case the attention it deserved. What did Detective Wagner do differently?
She brought fresh eyes and a tenacious spirit to the investigation. She partnered with a reserve officer named Jeff Bennett, and together they dug deep into the evidence, painstakingly reviewing old files and chasing down long-forgotten leads. They weren't content to simply let the case gather dust. They were determined to re-examine every detail, hoping to find something that had been overlooked.
So they were essentially starting from scratch, trying to piece together a puzzle that had been gathering dust for over 40 years.
Exactly. And one of the most important pieces of that puzzle turned out to be DNA technology. Remember that trace evidence found on Carla's dress back in '74. The technology to analyze it simply didn't exist back then. But by 2018, DNA testing had advanced dramatically. It had become a powerful tool for solving cold cases, offering hope to families who had waited years for answers.
So this could be the key to finally cracking the case. Did they have enough DNA to test?
They did. But there were a couple of major hurdles. First, the DNA samples were very old and might have degraded over time, making analysis more difficult. And second, the cost of testing was prohibitive for the underfunded cold case unit. It would cost around $20,000 money they simply didn't have. It seemed like another dead end.
It's so frustrating. Just when there's a chance for a breakthrough, they're stopped by financial constraints. It's like the system is rigged against solving these cold cases. It makes you wonder how many other cases could be solved if resources were allocated differently.
It's true. But sometimes in the darkest of times, the most unexpected help arrives.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What happened? Who stepped in to help?
Well, this is where the story takes an incredible turn. A woman named Diane Kirkendall, who knew Carla from high school and had become a true crime enthusiast, heard about the case on a podcast. She was so moved by Carla's story that she decided to take action.
That's amazing. One person, inspired by a podcast, decided to make a difference. It's proof that even ordinary people can have a huge impact.
Right. Deanne went to CrimeCon, a huge true crime convention, and started handing out flyers about Carla's case, hoping to raise awareness and maybe even find some new leads. And you won't believe who she met there.
Wait, don't tell me. Was it Paul Holes?
Paul Holes, the legendary cold case investigator who helped crack the Golden State Killer case, was at CrimeCon, and Deanne managed to give him a flyer about Carla.
Wow, talk about a stroke of luck.
Oh.
What did Paul Holes do?
He was immediately intrigued by the case. He saw the potential for DNA testing to finally bring answers, and he decided to help Paul Holes, and the producers of his TV show donated $18,000 to cover the cost of the DNA testing.
That's incredible. So thanks to the efforts of one determined woman and the generosity of Paul Holes, Carla's case finally had a fighting chance. It's amazing how sometimes the smallest actions can set off a chain of events leading to justice.
It really was a turning point. The DNA samples were sent to a specialized lab, and the results came back with a match. Len McCurley, the truck driver, who had been questioned and dismissed back in 1974.
The guy claimed his gun was stolen. Can't be a coincidence.
It wasn't. The police immediately went to McCurley's house and confronted him. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he didn't even remember Carla Walker. But as the interrogation continued, he started to crack, revealing inconsistencies in his story and mixing up details from different events.
So they knew they had the right guy, but he wasn't making it easy for them.
Exactly. But then, during a search of McCurley's home, the police discovered a hidden compartment above a door, and guess what they found inside?
His .22 Ruger, the one he claims was stolen all those years ago.
Bingo! That was the final piece of the puzzle. Glenn McCurley was arrested and charged with Carla Walker's murder.
After 46 years, Carla's killer was finally behind bars. It's almost unbelievable, but it also raises so many questions. What happened to him after his arrest? Did he confess? Did he have anything to do with those other unsolved murders in Fort Worth?
Well, before we jump into that, let's take a moment to shift gears and travel across the Atlantic to 1814 London. We'll explore the strange and tragic case of the London Bear Flood, a story that at first glance might seem completely unrelated. But as we delve deeper, we'll see how both cases raise profound questions about justice responsibility and the enduring impact of seemingly isolated events.
Okay, a decades-long manhunt, and now a sudden catastrophic flood of beer. I have to admit, this London beer flood sounds almost too strange to be true.
It does sound like something out of a tall tale, doesn't it? Almost like an urban legend. But the London beer flood was a very real event, and it tragically illustrates how industrialization, for all its advancements, also brought new and unforeseen dangers.
So set the scene for us. What was London like in 1814?
Imagine London in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, a time of incredible change. The city's population is booming, new technologies are emerging, and there's this sense of excitement, but also unease about what the future holds.
A real turning point in history, for sure.
Exactly. And alongside this progress, you have this stark inequality. Poverty is rampant, especially in overcrowded neighborhoods like the St. Giles Rookery, where our beer flood story takes place.
And this is where the Horseshoe Brewery was located, right? I remember reading about it. They were known for their massive vats of porter.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. It's one of London's largest breweries. And their vats, these were more than just containers for beer. You know, they were symbols of power and industrial might, almost like the skyscrapers of the brewing world.
Really?
There was this fierce competition among brewers to build bigger and bigger vats, each one holding hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer. It was a spectacle, a marketing ploy, a way to show off their dominance in the market.
So it was all about size, about pushing the limits of what was possible. But what about safety? Was anyone thinking about the potential consequences of having these enormous vats filled with fermenting liquid right in the middle of a densely populated neighborhood?
Well, that's the question that haunts this whole tragedy. It seems that safety concerns were definitely taking a backseat to the pursuit of profit and prestige. The vats at the Horseshoe Brewery were made of wood, held together by these giant iron hoops, much like a massive barrel. And one afternoon, one of those hoops snipped off.
Oh, they can't be good.
Oh,
Given the volume of beer we're talking about, a broken hoop sounds like a recipe for disaster.
yeah, you're right. But at the time, the brewery clerk, a man named George Crick, he didn't seem too concerned. Apparently, these hoops would slip off occasionally, and the other hoops were usually strong enough to contain the pressure. So he started writing a letter to inform the brewery owners about the broken hoop, figuring he'd send it off later that day.
So they knew there was a problem, but didn't see it as an immediate threat. It's a bit like ignoring a crack in a dam, hoping it won't turn into a flood.
Exactly. A dangerous gamble. And sadly, they underestimated the power of fermenting beer. As the beer ferments, you see it releases gases, which builds up pressure inside the vat. And without that crucial hoop, the structure was fatally weakened.
So what happened next?
Well, around 5:30 that evening, as George Crick was getting ready to leave, he heard this deafening explosion. The bottom of that giant vat had burst open, unleashing this unbelievable tidal wave of beer that ripped through the brewery and surged into the surrounding streets.
I can't even imagine the force of that much liquid being released so suddenly. It must have been like a tsunami of beer.
That's a pretty accurate description. Witnesses described it as a deafening roar, a wall of dark liquid 15 feet high, just smashing into buildings, tearing down walls, and sweeping people off their feet. Imagine the air thick with the smell of fermenting beer, and the streets running brown with this deluge. It was a scene of utter chaos and terror.
It's a horrifying thought. Did anyone survive this?
Tragically, no. 8 people lost their lives.
Oh my goodness.
A 14-year-old servant girl named Eleanor Cooper. She was crushed by falling bricks in the courtyard behind the brewery. And then several houses on this narrow street called New Street. They were completely demolished by the wave trapping residents inside.
So many lives lost.
And the most heart-wrenching story involves an Irish wake that was being held in a basement apartment. It was completely engulfed by the flood. 5 people drowned, including a 3-year-old boy.
That's just heartbreaking. To be mourning the loss of a loved one, and then to be struck by such a sudden and unexpected disaster, it's hard to even fathom.
It really is. The aftermath was just devastating. Rescue efforts began immediately with brewery workers and neighbors frantically searching for survivors amidst the wreckage and debris. People were wading through knee-deep beer, desperately listening for any signs of life. But the damage was just so extensive.
8 lives lost because of a broken hoop on a beer vat. It's a stark reminder that even seemingly small failures can have catastrophic consequences, and how quickly things can go wrong when safety is overlooked. So was anyone held accountable for this?
Sadly, that's where the story gets even more disturbing. A coroner's inquest was held to determine the cause of death and try to assign responsibility, but despite all the evidence pointing to negligence, the jury ruled that the deaths were accidental, an act of God. The brewery faced no legal consequences.
So essentially, they got away with it. It's almost as if the sheer absurdity of a flood of beer made it difficult to fully grasp the gravity of the situation.
It's an interesting point. Maybe the novelty of the event overshadowed the human cost? And get this, the brewery was even granted a tax refund for the lost beer. Essentially, a government bailout. It's a disturbing example of how power and wealth often shielded those responsible for industrial accidents from facing real consequences.
It's a familiar pattern, sadly. Profit over people. It's disheartening to see it repeated throughout history. But did anything good come out of this tragedy?
Thankfully, yes, the London beer flood did serve as a wake-up call for the brewing industry. They realized the inherent dangers of these massive wooden vats and began to shift towards safer materials like concrete and metal. They also started moving breweries away from densely populated areas, recognizing the potential for widespread destruction if another accident were to occur.
So this disaster, as awful as it was, at least led to some positive changes in the long run. It's a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, progress can emerge.
It does, and it serves as a powerful reminder about the importance of safety regulations, responsible industrial practices, and holding those in power accountable for their actions.
It makes you wonder if those 8 lives had been lost in a more conventional way, say in a factory fire, if there would have been more public outcry and a stronger demand for accountability.
That's a thought-provoking question. Perhaps the unusual nature of the event made it easier to dismiss it as just a freak accident rather than a preventable tragedy.
Okay, so we've gone from a decades-long search for a sisters killer to a terrifying flood of beer in 1814 London. 2 very different cases, but both raising some really important questions about justice, responsibility, and the fragility of life. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to Carla's case. What happened to Glenn McCurley after his arrest?
After McCurley's arrest, Jim Walker, Carla's brother, finally had the chance to confront the man who had haunted his family for nearly 5 decades. You see, during a pre-trial hearing, Jim, now visually impaired and using a guide dog, approached McCurley's wife and son and introduced himself.
Wow, I can only imagine the emotions in that room. What was their reaction?
McCurley's son was visibly shaken and apologized for what his father had done. But Jim, in an incredible act of compassion, told him that none of it was his fault and that his father had devastated both their families.
That's remarkable. After all those years of anger and pain, to show such empathy and understanding. It speaks volumes about Jim's character.
It really does. And then, just 3 days into the trial, faced with this mountain of evidence, Glenn McCurley changed his plea to guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison, finally bringing some closure to Carla's family and to the city of Fort Worth.
So after 46 years, justice was finally served. But did McCurley ever confess to any of the other murders that plagued Fort Worth during that time?
He didn't. McCurley died in prison in 2023, taking his secrets with him, so we may never know for sure if he was a serial killer or if those other cases will ever be solved. It's a lingering question mark that hangs over this story.
It's a bittersweet ending, isn't it? Justice for Carla, but so many questions left unanswered. It makes you think about the families of those other victims still waiting and hoping for some sense of closure.
It does. And it highlights the complex and often frustrating nature of the justice system. Sometimes, even when a perpetrator is caught, there are still so many unknowns, so many loose ends that may never be tied up.
Well, both of these cases remind us that the pursuit of justice can be a long and winding road filled with dead ends, false leads, and unexpected twists and turns. But as Jim Walker's story shows us, perseverance and determination can sometimes prevail, even after decades of uncertainty.
Absolutely. And the London beer flood serves as a stark reminder about the potential consequences of unchecked industrialization. It reminds us that progress should never come at the cost of human life, and that we need strong safety regulations and responsible practices to protect communities from these kinds of preventable tragedies.
It's certainly a lot to think about. The ripple effects of seemingly isolated events, the enduring power of hope, and the vital importance of holding those in power accountable for their actions. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these cases. What stood out to you? What questions are you left with? Share your reflections with us on our social media channels.
And as you go about your day, consider this. Both of these stories really highlight how interconnected our world truly is, how seemingly unrelated events can have a profound and lasting impact on individuals and entire communities, and how even in the face of tragedy and uncertainty, the human spirit can find ways to persevere, to seek justice, and to create a safer and more just world for everyone.